"You've got 10 seconds to take that flag down, or I'll have you arrested for domestic terrorism." That's what the so-called cop said to my 78-year-old grandfather on a quiet Tuesday morning, while standing in his driveway with mirrored sunglasses, a crooked badge clipped to a fishing vest, and a car that had "polite" instead of "police" written on the side. Grandpa didn't flinch. He slowly put down his coffee mug, adjusted his World War II veteran hat, and replied in the calmest voice I've ever heard, "Son, you've got 10 seconds to get off my lawn before you meet my son-in-law, the FBI agent who just got back from Quantico." What started as a breakfast with birdsong turned into the kind of showdown you'd see in a gritty Netflix drama, only with more barbecue sauce and fewer working brain cells on the criminal's end. It all began like any other morning in our sleepy suburb. My grandpa, Joe, had his usual porch routine: newspaper, decaf coffee, and grumbling at squirrels like they owed him money. He's the kind of guy who built his own garage from scratch in the 70s and still thinks WD-40 is the answer to 80% of life's problems. The front yard proudly displayed 2 flags, one American, one POW-MIA. On a tall steel pole he installed himself. They waved in the breeze like defiant symbols of history, respect, and a man who'd been through far worse than HOA drama. Then came the car. A black Dodge Charger rolled up like it was trying out for an action movie. The lights on top were the kind you'd find on Amazon for $49.99, and the badge he flashed looked like it had been printed at a gas station kiosk. But he had the attitude down, swaggering out of the car, puffing his chest, barking orders. He introduced himself as Officer Trent, Community Compliance Division. No one in the history of real police work has ever said those words. Grandpa didn't say much at first. He just stared at the guy with that look old soldiers have. The one that says, "I've dodged shrapnel and lived off beans in a foxhole, and now you're trying to scare me with cosplay?" But Trent was undeterred. He claimed there was a neighborhood ordinance banning military symbolism on private property. He said it made certain people uncomfortable. He even pulled out a laminated slip of paper that looked like it had been made in Microsoft Word and featured a misspelled version of our county's seal. My grandpa played along for about a minute. He nodded, asked polite questions, and even offered Trent a bottle of water from the cooler. That's when he subtly hit the silent alarm button he'd installed after a break-in 5 years ago. His silent way of texting the family group chat. I was next door, helping my mom set up for a welcome-home barbecue for her husband, Mark. He'd just returned from an extended deployment working high-stakes cases with the FBI. We were inflating balloons and seasoning ribs when her phone buzzed. "Text from Dad," she said, scanning it. Then her face changed. She handed it to me without a word. It read, "FBI needed at 1632 Maple. Clown at the gate. Bring Mark. Situation smells like hot garbage." We both turned to the window, saw the car, saw the idiot, saw Grandpa still sipping coffee like it was all a morning sitcom episode. Meanwhile, Trent's tone had shifted from fake-friendly to full-blown intimidation. He started demanding ID. He said Grandpa could be fined thousands of dollars. When Grandpa asked for his precinct, Trent stumbled. When asked for a badge number, he made one up on the spot. Grandpa nodded, leaned back in his chair, and with the smoothest delivery you've ever heard, said, "That's interesting. My son-in-law's with the FBI. You two must work together." Trent laughed nervously and tried to pivot. "Oh yeah? Which division?" That's when Mark stepped outside. Mark Daniels is the kind of guy who could make you confess to crimes you didn't commit just by raising an eyebrow. Built like an oak tree and dressed in casual jeans and a black FBI windbreaker, he didn't say anything at first. He just walked up, eyes scanning the situation like he was back in interrogation mode. Trent's smile faltered. He turned a bit pale. Mark finally spoke, slow and deliberate. "Badge, department, and dispatch channel. Now." Trent blinked. "Excuse me." Mark stepped closer. "You're impersonating a federal officer, which is a felony. That's 10 years in prison." If you run, I'll tackle you into the rose bushes. If you lie, I'll have you eating jail food by lunch. So let's try again. Trent stammered something about a misunderstanding and began inching toward his car. That's when Grandpa added cheerfully, "You might want to check your tires before you go, pal." Everyone turned and saw them, both rear tires slowly collapsing from carefully sliced gashes. Grandpa had pulled a little trick from his Navy days. He'd punctured the sidewalls with a small blade from his keychain multitool while offering that bottle of water earlier. Puncture and deflate. Quiet and clean. He muttered like it was a cooking tip. Trent panicked. He lunged into his car, tried to start it, but the engine didn't even turn over, because Grandpa had also unplugged the battery cable. At this point, Mark pulled out his actual badge and called for backup. Trent, realizing he was officially screwed, tried to make a run for it on foot. Bad idea. Grandpa tripped him with his cane as casually as someone swatting a fly. The man face-planted in the grass while Mark cuffed him with practiced efficiency. My mom was already calling local law enforcement to pick him up, and the neighbors, had started peeking out from behind their curtains. One even came outside with popcorn. By the time the local sheriff arrived, Trent was red-faced, grass-stained, and trying to argue that it was all a performance art piece, meant to raise awareness about law enforcement presence in communities. Grandpa didn't even dignify that with a response. He just took another sip of coffee, turned to Mark and said, "You think we can still get the brisket on before noon?" As sirens wailed in the distance and Trent screamed something about entrapment, Grandpa added, "Oh, and ask your buddies if they brought the good mustard this time." That was the day our sleepy street turned into a viral crime scene, the day a fake cop picked the wrong house, and the day we all realized that when your grandpa's got the FBI on speed dial, justice is only a text away. Back at our house, the barbecue that was supposed to be the grand welcome home party for my FBI brother-in-law Mark had been completely hijacked by the drama unfolding 2 doors down. The potato salad was still chilling, the ribs were mid-marination, and the folding chairs hadn't even made it out of the garage yet. But the entertainment? Oh, that had arrived early. And it was handcuffed on the lawn, face down, whining about his rights being violated, like he hadn't just tried to impersonate a federal officer in front of an actual one. Mark had barely even said a word while handling the situation, but that's kind of his thing. He doesn't need to shout. He's one of those rare people who can weaponize calm. He stood there now, arms folded, just watching the guy squirm as if he were mentally ticking off boxes on a checklist. I walked over with his sunglasses, which he'd left by the seasoning tray. "You want me to get the ribs on the grill?" I asked. He didn't even look away from the fake cop when he replied, "Give me 10 minutes. Let's make sure we're not in the middle of something bigger than just one dumb criminal with a light bar." Local law enforcement arrived not long after, and the responding officer, Sheriff Boone, a guy who's known our family for years, stepped out of his cruiser looking more amused than anything. He gave Grandpa a casual salute, nodded at Mark, and took one long look at Trent, who was now sitting on the curb looking like he regretted every decision since kindergarten. "You the idiot who thought you could play dress-up in this neighborhood?" Boone asked. Trent didn't answer. He just kept muttering something about misunderstandings and good intentions, which is about as convincing as yelling "fire drill" after getting caught setting a building on fire. Boone took Trent into custody, but not before Mark asked to inspect the guy's vehicle. That's where things took a turn from funny to serious real fast. The inside of the Dodge Charger was like a dollar store SWAT team exploded in it. Fake citation pads, phony IDs, clipboards with printed-out violation forms, several pairs of zip ties, and a taser that looked way too real to be just for show. There was even a fake service radio programmed with static so it sounded active. Mark looked at it all and said one word: amateur. Still, there was one detail that made his face tighten. Hidden under the passenger seat was a printed list, names, addresses, and short note. Grandpa's name was on it, along with several other older residents in the neighborhood. Some were marked intimidated, paid fine, or hostile. Mark's eyes moved down the page, noting the pattern. It wasn't just a prank. Trent was running a full-fledged scam, targeting vulnerable seniors by pretending to be a cop and threatening them into paying fake fines or letting him inspect their property. Grandpa had just been the latest mark. No pun intended. We brought the information inside while the cruiser pulled away. Grandpa settled into his recliner like it was just another Tuesday, but Mark was already on the phone with his field office, reading off the details. I caught phrases like multi-state pattern, potential RICO violation, and requesting tech support to trace the equipment origin. He wasn't treating this like a neighborhood nuisance anymore. This was federal. Back in the kitchen, Mom resumed prepping food, but you could see her mind racing too. "You think this guy was working alone?" she asked. Mark shook his head. "Nope. He's too sloppy to be the brains. Someone's making these kits, coordinating targets, maybe even taking a cut from what they collect. Could be a whole ring." Then he turned to me. "Can you pull the security footage from your porch camera?" I nodded and grabbed my laptop. Mark's FBI training kicked in like flipping a switch. One moment he was joking about ketchup brands, the next he was dissecting body language, license plates, timestamp. By the time ribs were finally sizzling on the grill, Mark had already looped in his supervisor, uploaded the video footage, and traced a few items in the charger to a known distributor of novelty law enforcement memorabilia, which sounded like a fake cop version of a black market flea market. It turned out Mark wasn't just visiting. He was technically on temporary reassignment to our regional FBI office. This mess with Trent? It had just become his newest active case. That's when Grandpa dropped a bombshell, mid-bite of a grilled sausage. "This ain't the first guy I've seen prowling the neighborhood in a fake uniform," he said casually, as if discussing the weather. Mark nearly dropped his water. "Come again." Grandpa leaned back. "About 3 weeks ago, someone came by saying he was with the fire department's emergency compliance unit. Wanted to inspect my gas line. I told him to shove it. Thought he was just confused. Now I'm not so sure." The room went silent. Grandpa never mentioned it because, in his words, it didn't seem important unless someone caught fire. But now Mark was connecting the dots in real time. This isn't just one guy running solo. This is a system. A playbook. They try different uniforms, different departments, and see what sticks. Elderly, retired, military, anyone who won't immediately call their bluff. He stood up, grabbed his phone, and began speaking in that clipped, mission mode voice. "We need to set a trap." That was the moment the barbecue turned into a federal operation. Instead of tossing beanbags in the yard, we were sketching out a sting. Grandpa was all in, naturally. "You want bait? I got bait. I'll shine up my medals and put my wallet on the porch if it helps." Mark grinned. "Not that kind of bait, Joe. But if you're willing to act like you bought into Trent's story, we can leak some info through local forums. Make it look like this neighborhood's ripe for scamming." It was genius. We'd stage a soft target, a vulnerable-seeming veteran who'd been successfully intimidated, with photos subtly leaked online to bait more fakes into showing up. Meanwhile, cameras, FBI agents, and a few rather serious local officers would be ready and waiting. Grandpa couldn't have looked more thrilled. "Finally," he said, cracking open a soda, "something more exciting than bingo night." As night fell and the grill cooled, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. People had seen the arrest. They'd seen the FBI jacket. And now, behind the scenes, we were preparing for more than just a cookout. Mark's calm expression never changed, but I could tell he was already 10 steps ahead, piecing together something bigger than any of us expected. Because this wasn't just about Grandpa's flag. This was about a conman walking into the wrong driveway on the wrong day, and accidentally poking a hornet's nest with federal credentials. By the next morning, the neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath. Nothing looked different on the surface. Mailboxes still stood crooked, sprinklers still ticked on at odd hours, and Mrs. Denton's yappy Pomeranian still tried to pick fights with passing joggers, but the undercurrent had shifted. Everyone had seen the fake cop being hauled off in cuffs, and word spread fast that Grandpa's son-in-law was FBI. Now there was a nervous energy, like people had just realized how easy it was for someone to show up with a badge and start making threats. The illusion of safety had been cracked, and no one could quite unsee it. Mark didn't waste a second. He set up shop in our living room, laptop open, coffee in hand, and a stack of files that seemed to materialize out of thin air. Grandpa offered him a foldable table and a lamp, declaring it the war room, and the name stuck. Mark had already coordinated with his regional office to run point on what he was now calling Operation Eagle Bluff, and yes, he gave it a codename. "Makes paperwork easier," he said, but I suspected he just liked the drama. The first thing Mark wanted to do was dig into who this Officer Trent really was. The arrest had produced a real name: Kenneth Walsh, age 33, previously arrested for fraud in Nevada and impersonating a fire marshal in Utah. Charges were dropped both times due to insufficient evidence, which Mark translated as, "He's slippery and good at covering his tracks." But this time, Kenneth had messed up by targeting someone connected to federal law enforcement. That put him on a whole new radar. What concerned Mark most wasn't Kenneth himself, it was the vehicle, the gear, and the notes. The level of detail meant there had to be a supplier, someone manufacturing or distributing these fake kits. Kenneth wasn't creative enough to put all that together on his own. A few phone calls and a federal warrant later, Mark was connected to a database of online orders made through a gray market store selling novelty uniforms and equipment. It turned out Kenneth had used prepaid cards to buy several police-themed items: badges, clipboards, stickers, even a police scanner app subscription. But what stood out most was the shipping address. It wasn't Kenneth's home. It was a warehouse. The warehouse was in a nearby industrial park about 30 minutes out of town. On the surface, it was listed as Pinnacle Event Rentals, a generic name that screamed front business. A few more keystrokes revealed that the LLC had changed ownership 3 times in 2 years, always to shell corporations based in states with little corporate oversight. That was red flag number 1. Red flag number 2 was the location's lack of online presence. No reviews, no website, no actual rental listings. Just an address and a disconnected phone number. Mark knew what this meant. This wasn't some guy running a little side hustle. This was a coordinated operation, a scam network providing fake authority gear to grifters like Kenneth across the country. It explained the zip ties, the fake forms, the list of addresses. They weren't just intimidating people. They were scaring them into compliance, collecting hush money, and moving on before anyone got wise. And in neighborhoods full of older veterans and retirees, who still respected badges and were reluctant to question authority, it worked like a charm. So Mark decided it was time for bait. He created a fake online identity for Grandpa, Joe Wilkins, a lonely widower with military service and a fat pension. Through a few carefully curated posts on veteran forums and neighborhood platforms, Mark leaked the story that Joe had been visited by a compliance officer and paid him $200 to avoid trouble. He attached a photo of Grandpa standing next to his flag, looking frail but proud, with a blurred stack of cash in one hand and a forged receipt in the other. It was designed to scream, "Easy target, low resistance, cash ready." Then we waited. It took 2 days for someone to bite. A new message popped up on the fake profile from an account named Civic Safety Ops 22. It was short and friendly, asking if Joe had received a follow-up inspection and warning him to be cautious about unauthorized city contractors. But Mark recognized the language. It was how these scammers initiated contact, playing helpful before switching to threats. Mark replied politely, pretending to be confused and worried. Within a few hours, another message came. This one included an offer. For $150, a certified safety agent could review his case and make sure everything was compliant. That was enough. Mark coordinated with local law enforcement to plant undercover agents at the house disguised as neighbors and utility workers. Cameras were hidden inside garden gnomes, mailboxes, even a pair of binoculars left casually on the porch railing. Grandpa, of course, was thrilled. He cleaned up the porch, made a fresh pot of coffee, and even put out cookies. "If I'm gonna be bait," he said, "I might as well be charming bait." The plan was simple. Lure the scammer in, confirm his intent, and arrest him on the spot. What wasn't expected was that more than one person would show up. On the third day, a white van rolled up around noon. 2 men got out. One wore a tan jumpsuit with "Inspection and Compliance Unit" printed in uneven block letters. The other wore a plain navy blue polo, but had a utility belt with fake tools clipped to it. They walked up confidently, clipboard in hand, and knocked on Grandpa's door like they'd done it 100 times before. Grandpa answered like a pro. "You boys with the safety people again?" he asked, voice shaky but polite. "I hope this doesn't cost me another $200. I'm on a fixed income." That line had been rehearsed. Mark watched from the live video feed in our living room, flanked by 2 local deputies and a federal tech analyst who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. One of the men replied, "Just routine follow-up, sir. We'll need to step inside and review your gas meter and smoke alarms. Could be fines if things aren't up to code." That was all they needed to hear. Mark gave the signal. Within seconds, agents swarmed from all directions. The men were tackled before they could even turn back toward the van. One tried to bolt through a neighbor's side gate, only to be tripped by a decorative garden hose. The other froze and surrendered immediately, hands up, stammering that he was just following instructions from the warehouse. The arrests confirmed everything. These weren't just isolated grifters. They were part of a distribution chain being fed through the warehouse Mark had flagged. Inside the van, authorities found more gear: fake IDs, contractor vests, and printed manuals with scripts to follow when dealing with clients. It was scripted intimidation at scale. And that's when Mark knew this case had just gone national. Because now they weren't just dealing with crooks, they were dealing with an operation. And someone, somewhere, was getting rich off fear. 3 days after the takedown in our front yard, the warehouse that had been sitting quietly in the industrial park was surrounded by more surveillance equipment than a spy movie. Mark had taken over a vacant office in the same complex under the pretense of a commercial lease, and from that temporary command post, he coordinated what he called a low-profile high-stakes operation. The goal was clear: get inside that warehouse without alerting whoever was running the show, gather enough evidence to issue a federal raid, and expose the full network that had been enabling these fake enforcement agents to intimidate vulnerable citizens across the country. He didn't want a local bust. He wanted to blow the entire operation wide open. What had started with one overconfident idiot threatening my grandpa with a badge sticker had now evolved into a full-blown investigation into an organized crime ring. The 2 guys from the van, now in custody, had already started to flip under pressure. One admitted he'd been hired through a forum on the dark web that connected independent contractors with gear and script. He claimed he thought it was a prank business at first, but then things got serious when he realized people were actually paying under threat. The other was quieter but confirmed that all of their tools came from a centralized supplier, and the pickups were always made at the same warehouse. Mark now had every justification he needed to dig deeper, but the challenge was to do it without triggering a full cleanup by the people inside. Mark reached out to his tech team, and within 24 hours they had drones, signal interceptors, and remote camera feeds trained on the warehouse. The place didn't get a lot of foot traffic, but deliveries came and went at odd hours, mostly late at night. Unmarked vans, anonymous couriers, pallets wrapped in black plastic. No real branding. The outside of the building was as bland as possible, like it had been designed to be ignored. But inside, they suspected it was operating like a production facility for scam materials: custom uniforms, fake inspection kits, IDs, and forged documents for any type of fake authority role a con artist could dream up. Grandpa, of course, wanted in. "You need someone on the inside. I'll go in disguised as a confused janitor. Nobody suspects the guy with a mop," he suggested over breakfast. Mark gently turned him down, but it was clear even the FBI couldn't match Grandpa's enthusiasm. Still, his part in the story wasn't over. They needed someone who could draw the rest of the network out into the open. Mark had a plan. They repurposed the Joe Wilkins profile again, pushing out updates on the forums that suggested Joe had been contacted by a new agent who claimed his prior fine hadn't cleared and now he owed back penalties. The trap was simple: make it seem like Joe was still an open target, vulnerable and compliant. And sure enough, within a day, a new contact reached out, this one offering to send a senior compliance official to resolve the matter in person. Mark used that window to trace the communication. It bounced through multiple VPNs, proxies, and encrypted chat apps, but his team eventually tracked the device to a specific office inside the warehouse. That gave them what they needed. He submitted the warrant, got it signed, and coordinated with both federal marshals and the local police to launch a coordinated entry at 4 a.m. Low traffic, low witnesses, and the element of complete surprise. The raid itself was swift but intense. The warehouse had security, but it was mostly deterrent level. Cheap cameras and a few private guards who had no idea what they were actually guarding. When law enforcement swept in, they moved like ghosts, neutralizing security and breaching the side entrance with precision. What they found inside left everyone stunned. There were 4 long assembly lines, each dedicated to a different kind of disguise. One for police gear, one for fire inspectors, one for city utility uniforms, and one that appeared to mimic federal agent. Each had shelves filled with costume-grade outfits, fake belts, plastic badges, identification printers, citation books, and even boot polish and nameplates. There were bins labeled "Standard Patter," filled with laminated cue cards that gave scammers scripts for different intimidation scenarios. A whiteboard on the far wall listed new targets by region. Next to it was a map with pins covering the western state. Red pins marked known successful collections. There were a lot of red pins. But what sealed the case was the office in the back. That's where they found the servers. Rows of hard drives filled with records, chat logs, payment trails, and what looked like a full client database. Hundreds of users, many recurring, who'd ordered enforcement kits for various types of schemes. Some were obvious con artists, but others were worse. Landlords using the gear to scare tenants, debt collectors impersonating marshals to break into homes, even a few reports suggesting the kits were used during political canvassing to intimidate voters. This wasn't a little grift anymore. This was a black market authority operation with real-world impact. Mark stood in the center of the warehouse that morning, surrounded by agents bagging evidence, reading the scripts aloud with disbelief, and shaking their heads at how elaborate it all was. "We always talk about identity theft," he muttered to me, "but this is authority theft. These people weren't just faking names, they were faking power. And the people who got scammed? Mostly elderly, mostly retired, mostly trusting of anyone who claimed to represent a badge or an agency." Back at the house, Grandpa was watching the news report about the raid like he was watching a game show he'd secretly bet money on. "Told you it was more than just some clown in a vest," he said, tipping his coffee toward the TV. The anchor was reporting that over 30 arrests had been made nationwide as part of the follow-up sweep, all traced back to clients of the warehouse network. Mark's team had compiled the evidence into a case file so thick it could have been used as a doorstop, and prosecutors were already filing charges for fraud, racketeering, and impersonating federal officers. But the part that made Grandpa laugh out loud? One of the people arrested in another state was trying to run the same scam, pretending to be an HOA safety officer. "That's not even a thing," he said between cackles. "What's next, fake pet licensing agents?" As much as we were all relieved, there was a quiet sense of anger too. That people like Kenneth had gotten away with it for so long. That real authority figures had been impersonated to hurt the people who trusted them most. But in our little pocket of suburbia, it felt good to know that justice had caught up. And that it all started with one grumpy old veteran who didn't buy the act for even a second. Still, Mark wasn't finished. "We shut down the warehouse," he said, flipping through reports, "but I guarantee there are more out there. And this time, they know we're watching." Grandpa just sipped his coffee, grinned, and said, "Then I hope they like being on camera. Because next time, I'll be waiting with cookies and a spotlight." A week after the warehouse raid, the neighborhood was back to its regular rhythms, but with a twist. Grandpa's house had become a local legend, the kind of place people pointed to when giving directions or gossiping on evening walk. Everyone knew the story by now. The fake cop, the FBI son-in-law, the hidden scam ring, the takedown, and no one would ever look at a uniformed stranger the same way again. Grandpa, for his part, acted like it was no big deal. He still watered the lawn every morning, still complained about the city recycling schedule, and still waved at every passing car with the same calm demeanor. But now he did it all with just a little more flair, a quiet pride behind his eyes. He hadn't just stood up to a con man, he'd helped expose a nationwide operation. And to him, that was just another Tuesday. The media picked up the story fast. First local news, then a regional paper, and finally, a national network ran a segment titled, "The Vet and the Badge: How One Man Took Down a Crime Ring from His Front Porch." They interviewed Mark, who gave his standard government-issue response full of words like operation and multi-jurisdictional cooperation. Then they interviewed Grandpa, who wore his veteran cap and opened with, "Well, I was just trying to finish my coffee." By the time it aired, people were calling the house to say how inspiring he was. A few even mailed in letters. One envelope just had, "Hero Grandpa," somewhere in America, scribbled on it, and somehow it still made it to our mailbox. Mark had returned to his usual fieldwork, but for once, he seemed content to stay local. The success of the sting had earned him some leeway from his supervisors, and he was temporarily assigned to the regional task force now expanding the investigation. The warehouse bust had uncovered records going back over 3 years, and they were finding branches of the operation in other cities. Copycat setups and franchised scam kit. It turned out the fake cop epidemic wasn't rare at all. It had just flown under the radar, hidden by uniforms and fear. But even as law enforcement dug deeper, something else was happening closer to home. Our neighborhood had changed. People were more alert, more connected. Folks who had once waved from a distance were now chatting over fences. A neighborhood watch formed overnight, led by none other than Grandpa, who insisted on calling it the Porch Patrol. He hosted weekly coffee meetings on his lawn where people could share suspicious sightings, talk about security cameras, or just vent about that one guy down the street who never picked up after his dog. It was ridiculous and wonderful at the same time. Then came the ceremony. It wasn't planned by us. It was organized by the City Council and the local Veterans Association. They wanted to recognize Grandpa for his role in uncovering the scam, and Mark for his coordination with federal and local agencies. We thought it would be a small thing, maybe a certificate and a handshake. Instead, we got a parade. Not a full marching band kind of parade, but a line of classic cars, military vehicles, and even a group of veterans on motorcycles, roaring down our street in a show of support. The whole block came out to watch. Someone even brought a food truck. At the front of it all was Grandpa, riding in the back of a vintage army jeep with the biggest grin I'd ever seen on his face. Next to him sat Mark, looking slightly uncomfortable in the spotlight, but proud nonetheless. When they reached the end of the block, a small stage had been set up by the park, and the mayor presented Grandpa with a plaque that read, "For courage, integrity, and a legendary right hook to crime." Everyone laughed, even Grandpa, though he pointed out he hadn't actually hit anyone. "Well," the mayor said, "the cane counts." Mark received a commendation from the city and a surprise visit from 2 FBI reps who delivered an official letter of recognition. The crowd clapped, cheered, and whistled, but what made Grandpa emotional was what came next. A group of local veterans stepped forward, flag in hand. It was pristine, folded military style, with a certificate stating it had flown over the Capitol in his honor. Grandpa held it like something sacred. For a moment, he didn't say a word. Then he looked out at the crowd and said, "They tried to use a badge to scare me. But I've seen real courage, real service. You can't fake that." The applause didn't stop for a full minute. After the ceremony, people mingled in the park while kids ran around and the smell of grilled hot dogs filled the air. It felt like one of those perfect moments you never see coming. The kind that makes you forget all the stress and chaos that led to it. But just as things started winding down, something happened that gave us one last twist to the story. A man in a dark windbreaker, tall and clean-shaven, approached Mark quietly. They spoke for a few minutes off to the side, and I saw Mark's face shift from curiosity to concern. When he came back, he looked more focused than I'd seen him in days. "That was Homeland Security," he said. "They've been tracking similar scams tied to extremist group. Some of the fake officers weren't just after money, they were gathering intel. Looking for people to pressure, blackmail, or recruit." The celebration suddenly felt more serious. But it also added weight to everything Grandpa had done. His instincts, his refusal to be intimidated, his unwillingness to just let it slide, it had stopped more than just a scam. It had potentially derailed something far darker. And Mark knew it. "We're going to keep digging," he told us. "This goes deeper. But thanks to Grandpa, we're starting from a place of strength." That night we all sat on the porch together. The flags swayed gently in the breeze, and the last rays of the sun turned the sky a soft orange. Grandpa sipped his decaf, looking satisfied. Mark leaned back, arms crossed, watching the horizon like he was already planning his next move. I asked Grandpa if he ever imagined something like this happening when he bought the house. He chuckled. "I figured I'd battle squirrels, not scammers. But hey, if you're gonna live long, you might as well make it interesting." We all laughed, but the truth hung there in the air. One fake cop had knocked on the wrong door. And because of that, a scam ring was exposed, families were protected, and justice was served, alongside coffee, barbecue, and a side of Grandpa's quiet defiance. The world might be full of people pretending to be something they're not. But in the end, it only takes one real person standing their ground to remind the rest of us what truth looks like.